We're continuing with A Prophet for Our Time by Rabbi Stephen Pruzansky about the book of Yehoshua, Joshua. And at this point, Joshua, in the story, the spies, who we understand to be Caleb and Pinchas, are preparing to leave the home of Rachav, the harlot, after she has given them the information that they needed to return to Joshua to plan the conquest of Jericho. This information we're still kind of struggling with. What was the significance of it? But let's take it from here. The question has been raised earlier: what was the need of the Jewish people to have a homeland? It was asked previously, right? It almost seems like a ridiculous question, and it led us into a complicated story about the Dalai Lama without a homeland and how he was surviving. And the only reason anybody would ever raise this question today is that we survived remarkably for 2,000 years without a homeland, that we had sovereignty of. There were always Jews in the land of Israel, there was always an element of it, but we didn't have sovereignty there at all. But certainly at the time of the destruction of the temple, nobody would have asked that question. It was obvious that this homeland was needed. Right? So let me read a little bit about what Rabbi Pruzansky says about this, and we'll discuss it in more detail. The Jewish people were not bequeathed the land of Israel for its diamonds, crops, or material bounty. But because we yearn to perfect the world, the land of Israel is the foundation from which our message goes forth. Our fondest desire is tikkun olam, the perfection of the world, and that is not possible as long as mankind is gripped by aggression, materialism, corruption, and unrestrained pursuit of man's baser instincts. Our task, the Jewish task, is to convey to the world the appropriate answers to the spiritual dilemmas of life, the purpose of existence, the correct way to live, the timeless moral norms of the Creator, the true ideas of God. This mandate can only be fulfilled when we dwell in the land in peace and security as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So it sounds like a big responsibility, and others might have said the same. It seems like an inflated view of who we are. However, I think if one looks back at the history of the last 2,000 years, you can see that in spite of the fact that we were a very small nation, that we had no land of our own, and really even back to the beginning of the Exodus from Egypt, that this was a people whose destiny was more tied up with moral responsibilities than anything else. You will know the nature of a stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You will not treat a stranger harshly because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Our history is a history in which we seem to be prepared for a role to play having to do with the betterment of mankind. And whether misguided or not, you can see that, as Jean-Paul Sartre said, that every movement of progressive social change, right, involves Jews at the front of it. Whether it's Trotsky in the Bolshevik Revolution, or David Dubinsky in the ILGWU unions, in socialism and feminism, it's always a Jewish name you see at the front of it. Others are too. But clearly we have a almost genetic, I would say spiritually genetic DNA that requires us to devote an inordinate amount of time not to bettering simply ourselves, but to bettering the world itself and making it a more decent and a more equitable place for everybody. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which was really the earliest of the organizations that was created for the civil rights of black people in America, was an organization that was founded in tandem. The first board of directors were Jews and blacks, because we feel a need always to bring justice to those who are denied justice. We remark that there is a Pharaoh in every generation, right? And when there is a Pharaoh, right, of course we are the focus of his attack, and we're going to come to this in a second. But to make the claims that Rabbi Brzezinski makes, I think, can be proven historically. We have the answer to mankind's questions and the cure to what ails them. But as long as we are unaware or unworthy of our mission, and as long as mankind is incessantly drawn to its materialistic passions, the realization of that mission will be delayed and mankind's misery will be prolonged. Now, there are those people who might describe the Jewish people as a fountain of creation of wealth, intellectual giants, scientists, Nobel Prize winners, right? But how do we see it historically, right? We are, says the Kuzari, the world's heart. The world's heart, right? It says the Zohar, the world's intellect, right? Which is where the soul resides, right? And finally, right, quote Mark Twain, we are the world's conscience, right? And, these things are not always well loved by those that see our gaze, so to speak.
It's actually describing it like this, but I don't think that this is how people describe Jews. Describe Jews of bringing greed and depravity and into the world.
That's slandering Jews. That's slandering Jews, and you do that in order to try to destroy them, right? But the recognition of the holiness of Jews is constantly in the literature of other people other than us. But by the way, with holiness comes the worst kind of fall. Mm-hmm. Those people who are not given the potential of holiness, right, don't ever fall as far as we do, mm-hmm. right? You have peaks and valleys. We have very high peaks and we have very low valleys. Mm-hmm. And that's part of it. Tumah of a Jew is greater than any tumah in the world. Impurity of a Jew, mm-hmm. right? But so is Kedusha as well.
Mm-hmm. You mean the dead Jew you're talking about?
Tumah associated with the Jew, mm-hmm. right? Whatever the reason is. Of course, death is the most significant.
Impurity.
Right. Impurity.
Kind of
right. For these tasks, we are a nation that provides the world with its spiritual substance. That's from the Kuzari, right? For these tasks, the land of Israel serves as HQ, our headquarters. And our original entry into the land was designed as a precursor of the Messianic era. Right, now we're going to get into this in more detail. Because clearly one of the requirements of Mashiach is to have a nation. Mm-hmm. You're not a king of, scattered people. You're not a virtual internet king. You actually have to have a nation. You have to have all of the elements of a nation, whether it's armies or roads or legislature. All of those things are part of a national entity. Right? Judiciary. As the Zohar states, had Moshe Rabbeinu succeeded in bringing us into the land of Israel, the temple would have been built immediately without any possibility of destruction or exile. Everything that Moshe touched had a permanence to it. Right? So you might be asking, well, the temples were destroyed. Right? They were destroyed, but the Mishkan itself was not destroyed, ever. And the Chazal write about it, it's in the Midrash as well, that when the purpose of the Mishkan ended and the temple was built, the elements of the Mishkan were all packed up neatly the way you do at the end of a camping season, mm-hmm. Put away dryly into a deep, deep place to be stored, right? And they remain there.
Nobody knows where it is.
I don't know where they are.
It's somewhere in the area of the temple. There's no wall.
Could be anywhere from Shiloh to the temple. We believe it's somewhere under the temple. Yeah. But there's an idea that whatever Moshe Rabbeinu touched had a permanence to it. And had he been the one to bring us into the land as opposed to Joshua, we would never have been exiled, right? And had he built the temple would have continued to exist. Now, there is a good side to this and a bad side. The bad side is these things didn't happen. The good side is if we had committed errors, sins, and the temple couldn't be destroyed, the alternative would have been much worse. Because we understand that God's wrath was taken out more on bricks and mortar than it was on the people itself. The nation was allowed to exist even in exile, in spite of its sins. And the sacrifice was really, and we use the term korban, meaning sacrifice, actually, in that process.
Korban means sacrifice?
No. Korban means,
Korban.
but they're very similar words. Destruction.
No,
It means destruction.
There is a connection
is a
between...
It's a destruction.
Korban and
Right.
Korban.
Yeah.
No, Korban is destruction and Korban
Right.
is a sacrifice.
Right.
But there is a connection?
There is a relationship, right? And it was a sacrifice for which the nation was allowed to continue, right? And a destruction.
Can I ask you a question? There is a whole theology exists of there is no need for Jews to have a land.
Yes, there is.
How could it, where it based on? Just on experience?
I think it is based on that we didn't have a land. Who could say Native Americans shouldn't have a land? Everybody argues they should have something, right? They should have something, right? They lost a lot of wars, and the consequence was that, as happens to nations that lose wars, they're diminished dramatically. But nobody says that they shouldn't have a land, right? Who would say that the Germans after the Second World War shouldn't have a land? In fact, as you know, Charles de Gaulle said, well, I love them so much, there's two Germanys, East and West, right? We don't hold that to be true of anybody but the Jews, right? That the Jews somehow don't deserve a land. But this is part of an idea of destroying the Jews.
But
right?
maybe because fact says that you can live without land.
See you later.
Say goodbye to everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Make sure the hat and
Yeah.
gloves.
I think that the only possibility for that theology, even among Jews themselves,
Yeah, it's among
Right.
Jews. I'm talking.
is the idea that you don't have it, we managed, who needs it? But we all know that in order for the Messianic dream to be fulfilled, Israel has to be in Jewish hands. It's an absolute requirement. It's very clear. Chazal and prophets everywhere, that's a requirement. Right?
Jewish and religious, Jewish, the fact now.
No, the argument is not among not religious Jews as to whether or not there should be a state of Israel. The argument is how the state of Israel should come about, right? If the way it comes about is by a violent destruction of an enemy, right, then those people, there are arguments, and I don't want to go into all the details of it now, we will later, that say this is not the way the state should be founded. It should be founded miraculously, and we should just be able to enter the state, part of the Messianic process. A close friend of mine pointed out that in the War of Independence, most of the land was conquered except the religious sites. Hebron wasn't conquered, the Temple Mount wasn't conquered, we didn't get back the tomb of Rachel Amena, Shechem, right? None of those sites were, and we know people of my generation grew up, and the holy city of Israel was Tzfat, because what they had of Jerusalem was not viewed as a holy city. They would look across a wire fence at a holy city. So this idea, this came back in '67, and hopefully will finish coming back shortly. But the idea that we should have a land, I think nobody disputes that. The question is how you go about obtaining the land is the issue. And most people understand that that it's intended to be miraculous. I think that there are many people who would agree that the Jewish return to the land of Israel can only be described as miraculous. The wars that were won, the immigration, the nation that's been built, in the last 60 some odd years, if anybody would argue that that's not a miracle, I would want them to show me some historical precedent for that with any other nation. There is none. There's no question about it. And we see these miracles repeating every day. In the midst of hardship, in the midst of violence, in the midst of all kinds of difficulties. A nation in the Middle East with virtually no natural resources, whose single natural resource is its people.
Determination.
I will take a sidebar for a moment, a personal sidebar. Right? It's a nation who turns to the Jewish grandmothers, who may be religious or not religious, and say, if you have 3 weeks, right, come serve in our military, right? We need you. We want you to be part of it. You understand, most nations discard people in their 70s.
Of course.
Israel doesn't. It says, we need you to sort this. We need you to help with this. We'll give you a day off every now and then, right? But you get a uniform and you serve. And by the way, are you okay taking orders from younger people? So, right? This is a nation that has embraced its single greatest natural resource, and that's the souls and the intellects and the bodies of their people. And they have had an appropriate response from the people.
Babushka's going to serve.
But I think it's absolutely remarkable. To me, not just remarkable that she's doing it. Remarkable that they have this whole program set up to do it.
Because we know friends who are also in the older age, same like also they were doing it numerous times.
But what I'm saying is, this is the miracle of this place. It is a dried piece of desert without oil. In a place that is covered with oil, right? That's what we got, right? Now, ironically, at a time where it's very important, it seems even that is changing. So, the miracles of the land, if you're saying to me that in order for us to take back the land of Israel, it has to be miraculous, I say it is. I say it is. I say it's an act of God, right? Just as much as it was an act of God for Jewish armies to be able to march through the land originally and succeed, right? So it has been this time as well. But we'll come to understand that better as we go forward.
But even if, David, whatever you're talking about natural resources, that it's a desert, doesn't have, but at the same time they're writing that as much as the oil in Saudi Arabia and there in Peninsula is diminishing, in Israel it's found, gas and all those resources which are becoming...
Yeah, I know.
That's
true. At the time, this is news. This is like news in the last 3 years, right?
Yeah, but
it's not what we anticipated. And you could say the same thing about, what are you talking about? It's a desert, right? Has huge, Gaza was at one point the greatest exporter of flowers under the Jewish community. Right now, it's a different situation, right? I grew up with the idea of oranges from Jaffa or what? Gush Katif. Yeah, Gush Katif. Gush Katif. I'm sorry, not Gaza. Gush Katif. The agriculture of Israel is second to none. All over Africa, they're begging for the technology. Not from America, not from England, not from Europe, but from Israel, because Israel has a climate that is coping with these things. And it has the intellect there to resolve these problems. Let's move on. So in order for all of these things to happen, right, for the Messianic era to come about, we have to have the land of Israel. And so the beginning of this process, we're talking about in this book now. Right? It wasn't having the land of Israel under Abraham's time, because Abraham was largely a stranger in the land. He bought a place to bury his family. Yeah. Right? Yaakov was, on the run a large part of his life. Yitzchak was back and forth to Philistia and different places, right? Yeah. Promises were made to them that this will be yours, but it wasn't theirs. Now we're seeing this promise come true, right? In this book, and God willing, again in the news on a daily basis. Right? Had Moshe succeeded in bringing us into the land of Israel, the temple would have been built immediately without any possibility of destruction or exile. But Moshe sinned at the waters of Meribah, and we never fully embraced our mission, and that historical era still awaits us. Right? It was not completed. What the reasons in detail, we won't go into all of it right now. When the spies left Shittim, the place of immorality, the place, as we said before, where they had previously sinned with the Midianite women, and where they had had a devastating plague of 24,000 people killed as a result of that. You know? When the spies left from Shittim, the place of immorality, and emerged from the house of Rachav, chaste, pure in body and soul, Yehoshua recognized that the conquest of the land was at hand. This was his test, right? We'll come back to, we said this before, right? What was it that Yehoshua wanted to know? What was it that Joshua wanted to know by sending them not to check, where the walls were weak, not to check, were there places of heights where you could launch catapults and everything. He wanted to know the moral power of the people versus the moral power of his own people. Now, he may have stacked the deck a little bit because he chose Pinchas Caliph to be his test, right? But he also chose their very best, right? We talked about it before. Rachav was the best at what she did as well. Right? They entered a brothel and emerged not with the world's most infamous prostitute, but with a future convert, with a penitent. The Jewish nation was ready to proceed to its destiny at that point. They understood that the weakness of the society that they were going to deal with if their high priestess was ready to convert at that point. The spies asked Rachav to suspend the scarlet thread from her window as a sign of their mutual covenant. Behold, when we come to the land, you bind the scarlet cord in the window from which you lowered us, and your father, mother, brothers, and all of your father's household shall you gather into your home. Right? Then it shall be that anyone who leaves the doors of your house for the outside, his blood and guilt shall be upon his own head, and we will be clean. But anyone who will be with you inside the house, his blood guilt shall be on our head, if a hand lays upon him. This is the voice of the spies speaking to Rachav. And she said, like your words, so it is. And she sent them away, and she tied the scarlet cord to the window. Now, let's think for a minute. The scarlet cord is mentioned other times in the Torah. Does anybody remember any mentions of it?
Azazel?
What?
Very
good, right? Very good.
During Yom Kippur, right? For the sacrifice.
Yeah, Azazel.
And Azazel, when Gadol, isn't he by the foot?
It's connected, right? It's in a sense part of the same thing. The idea that God says, let's sit and reason together, and even if your sins are scarlet, they will become white on Yom Kippur, right? I think, come let us reason together, says God. If your sins are like scarlet, they will become white like snow. It's from Yeshayahu, right? So that's a reference to scarlet. Right? The idea that you're transforming that which is wrong into that which is good. It's a sign of penitence. It's not, as we think it is, as a sign of a scarlet woman, was an expression in the Victorian days, right? That was a harlot. This is actually, for us, a sign of the ability to transform. Right? Ability to transform, right? So, now, is there another one? Anybody think of another one?
But we discussed before the Eshes Chayil.
Eshes Chayil?
She dressed in scarlet.
I don't see the connection.
There is. There is. What, between Eshes Chayil?
I don't see the connection.
What does it mean that she's wearing crimson? It says she was red, dressed in red. What does it mean?
I don't see the connection.
You don't see the connection. Okay, the Medrash sees a connection to Rachav, specifically to Rachav. It raises that. And clearly what we're saying is that there is a passion connected to this. And this passion, right, as opposed to kind of a blasé understanding of our relationship with God, this passion which Rachav had and was able to transfer, as Yitro was able to as well, right? This passion has great merit. And it protects them from what? It protects them from ice and snow, just snow specifically. But there is a Gehenna of ice and snow. There's a Gehenna of ice and snow, right? And that Gehenna is a very interesting Gehenna. The Gehenna, the hell,
Yeah.
right, that we're most familiar with is a very hot one, right? And that's intended to sear, so to speak, the averas that we have committed. Those things which we should not have done that we did, that one may have done, right? It's to cleanse us of those things before we enter Gan Eden. So what is the Gehenna of ice about? It's a curious thing, right?
Gehenna of
Ice and snow. It says that the Ashes Chayil has no fear of the snow because her children are dressed, the family's dressed in red wool, right? So it's a very important thing to understand is that the mitzvahs are divided into two groups, right? Aseh and Wa'aseh, right? That which we are forbidden to do and that which we should do, right? Those that we're forbidden to do, let's say on Pesach, we're forbidden to eat bread, right? Eating bread is a very serious avera, no question about it, right? But we have another mitzvah on Pesach, which is you must eat matzah, right? On the first day, you have to eat matzah at the Seder. It's a mitzvah to do it, right? So it's two separate mitzvahs. Don't eat bread, do eat matzah, right? Those of us, and we generally hold that violating a mitzvah, a mitzvah that you're prohibited to do, a negative mitzvah, is more serious than omitting a mitzvah that you should have done. That is to say, it's much more serious, in this case, to eat bread on Pesach. It's much more serious to eat bread on Pesach, to violate this mitzvah, than it is not to eat matzah. Right? Not to eat matzah. Right? So the Gehenna, right, and generally speaking, when we don't do a mitzvah we're supposed to do, when we violate a mitzvah we're not supposed to do, it can often be a conscious thing that we shouldn't do, right? You know, I don't want to pick examples; it's not appropriate, right? But not doing a mitzvah we're supposed to do often comes from a lackadaisical state. Lackadaisical. You know that. It's very cold. I can't get my car door open. It's icy outside. Nobody's going to shul today. I think I'll daven at home. I won't daven with a little bit lazy. A little bit lazy, a little bit not committed. Not committed, okay?
What is example now?
I'm giving it. I'm giving it, right? When a person says, you know, there's a famous story of the Chofetz Chaim. Right? Chofetz Chaim, great tzaddik, right? He would, and we shouldn't think that a tzaddik doesn't deal with the Yetzer Hara too, right? The desire for relaxation and comfort over the desire to strain oneself to do the right thing. And it says that in Radin, in Poland, in the middle of the winter, you know, when you're in your 80s, there are days where you could say, you know, instead of going to the 7 o'clock minyan, I'll go to the 8:30. Right? I'm the Rosh Hashiva. I'll grace that minyan today, right? Instead of the 7. And it said that the Chofetz Chaim used to wake up on such a day in mid-February. It's still dark out. And he would look, and suddenly he would become very angry. And he would say, how is it that you're dressed and ready? You're already doing your job and I'm still laying in bed. You're already there. And he's talking to his own Yetzer Hara, right? That my Yetzer Hara, which is saying to me, you know, take it easy, right? He's not laying in bed. He's working. He's doing his job, right? So the mitzvahs that we should do that we don't do, right? As opposed to the ones we shouldn't do and we do, or we're forbidden to do and we do it. The ones that we're encouraged to do, but we don't do because something else is more important, I'm not up to it. Those things usually come from a kind of laziness somewhere. Right? For those, and because we don't have passion for the mitzvah, right? The passion that the Chofetz Chaim exhibited overcame his desire to let his old creaky bones stay in bed in mid-February because he had a passion, a fire burning to do the right thing.
Right?
Let me just finish the thought. The idea here is that he has a mitzvah to do something. Right? And he didn't feel like doing it, like the rest of us, on such a day, right? But he overcame it. For those of us who don't overcome it, that's the Gehenna of ice. Mm-hmm. Right? You were cool about the mitzvahs, now you're going to be very cool. Cold, freezing, right? So it says that the Ashes Chayil's children, right, have no fear of this. Why? Because they're dressed in the scarlet of Rechav, who is a passionate follower, convert to Judaism when the time came. That's the connection. Sorry, I went all the way around a circle to get to it. But that's really what the reference is to at the end of the day. So another use of the scarlet ribbon, right? And by the way, another use of a ribbon is that we tie the first fruits with a ribbon, right? I don't seem to remember a reference to scarlet, but it may be that the first fruit is not necessarily the first one that's ripe, but it's the first one that produces the beginning of a fruit. Right? At that point, farmers will tie it. Yes, that was my hint. Exactly.
The parrots are out, yes. The Zerach and Peretz when they were from Tamar.
The daughter of
the food came out.
Hand.
And they put over the
hand. They put the ribbon.
Yeah. So this is very significant. This probably because it is that string that we're talking about here. Is that the Yehuda had relations with his daughter-in-law Tamar. We've learned about this recently, right? And from her came two twins, right? Zerach and Peretz, right? Who was the first one which was born? Anybody know?
Zerach. Peretz was just the hand.
No, it was the other way. Peretz Peretz was the first one to emerge completely. It was Zerach's hand that had the ribbon tied around. But Peretz, because of his strength, Peretz is right.
Exactly what it
pushed in front. Exactly. He pushed in front of his twin. There were two children in the womb of Tamar, right? And who was to be firstborn? Zerach reached outside of his mother, and the doula, the midwife, right, knowing that these were twins, tied a ribbon around his hand so that everybody would understand who was the firstborn. And she said, "This is the firstborn," right? And right after she tied it around his hand, he withdrew his hand back into his mother. He wasn't so anxious to come out yet. And his brother, Peretz, pushed in front of him, right? And so Peretz got the name, right? Peretz got the name of strength, meaning of power, of pushing, that he pushed his brother aside because he was anxious to have this role, right? And Zerach got the name rising, that he was, it's a positive name, right, from Zerah, right? And he was the one whose hand came out first, but not who came out first, right?
Well, the second meaning is the shine.
There's a...
What? Shine.
Shining. Yeah,
shine.
You're right. Yeah. Zohar is the same word. Same word, right? So the Midrash Haggadah, right, says that these were the two spies.
Oh, different two spies instead of...
Instead of, as we've learned that it's Pinchas and Kalev, right? It says that it's Peretz and Zerach, right? But it doesn't really mean that. You have to understand. And it makes a statement, right?
But time-wise it's possible.
It's not possible. No, they were Yehuda. Yehuda came down to Egypt, right? Right? These are the sons of Yehuda, right?
But I mean, time-wise, they could be 40-year-old.
No, they have to be 210 years old.
Yeah, it's before.
Right. Yeah.
Just came down.
We don't really think of it. It's a kind of a spiritual statement, right? I don't want to go into Gilgulim or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about here. But it's a statement that the Medrash is saying. Why? Because they want us to understand who are Peretz and Zerach, right? They are the forerunners of Mashiach, right? It's from Peretz that they'll descend eventually, right? So
forerunners because they're the forefathers.
Because they are the line of Yehuda, right? Yeah. So it's a statement that this moment of entering the land, this moment of, say, the conquest of Rachav, really, right, is a moment of the beginning of the Messianic process in the land of Israel, right? That's the significance of it, right? And the purple string is connected to that, right? And right, so it says in here it says, of course. The Midrash Gadol asserts that Yeshua's spies were indeed Peretz and Zerach. Of course, this is not meant to be literal. Rather, Chazal taught that Yeshua's spies catalyzed the Messianic process, right? That began with the birth of Peretz. By hastening our conquest of the land of Israel, this infantile struggle between Peretz and Zerach, remember, Zerach was the one who had the river, symbolized the suddenness of redemption. Right? And this is actually one of the natures that we seem to have, is that at the time, we're just reading this week's Parsha, right? In which Moshe failed to take the Jews out of Egypt. He was sent to Egypt, he confronted Paro, and Paro said, you know the trouble with your people? They have too much time on their hands. They don't work hard enough. They should focus on their job. From now on, they'll do the same thing. No straw. Let them collect it themselves. Right? I'm not supplying it. It's time they focused on what their job is to work for me. And, Dasan and Aviram, in the voices of the taskmaster, said to Moshe Rabbeinu, you put a sword in the hand of Paro. And they chased him out of Egypt at the expense of his own life. And what did he say at the end of last week's Parsha? You sent me there. Why did you do such evil to these people? Why did you cause such harm to these people? It would have been bad enough that you hardened Paro's heart. But it wasn't Parv. It didn't get better. It got much worse, right? And God's response was,
now you will see.
Only now. Only now. Right? Yes, when all hope is lost, even your hope, even you who have seen me in the burning bush, have given up. Now let's go and do the job. Right? So the idea of redemption happening very suddenly, right, is built into this process. The idea of Peretz pushing through this way is suddenly taking the lead in this thing. Right? And I have to tell you, some people may think that 60 years is gradual, for the land of Israel. But I have to tell you, it is the blink of an eye. It is so sudden that nobody's grandparents in their childhood, who are living today, could have imagined this could happen. Absolutely. Maybe we'll resettle the land. Maybe we'll have some say in the land, whatever. Right? But the idea that the power, the brilliance, the imagination, right, of this nation, nobody could have imagined that this would all gel the way it did in the time it has. Baruch Hashem, it should continue. It should continue. So,
can I just ask you a question?
Yeah.
I think it always bothers me. I understand that now what prevents what happened with the nation when they were in Egypt, the fact that we still have hope, or we just pretend that we have hope that Mashiach is coming. There is a part of Jewish nations who supposedly believe in the coming of Mashiach.
Yeah.
Orthodox Jews believe that Mashiach is coming. They should stop believing, and then Mashiach will come. When Moshe said, you lost the emunah.
No.
It's not exactly.
No, we've actually already been through that. We've already been through in our own lifetimes, some of our lifetimes, the actual darkest days that could have been imagined for the Jewish people. You know, and that sense of hopelessness, right? And, you know, I mean, remember who fought the wars of independence. Yes, there were the Paul Newmans and the Savras from Exodus, right?
People who survived
But
Holocaust.
there was an awful lot of people who were, you know, brought into the land that were survivors.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
in many ways probably felt they had nothing to lose at this point. We have to fight this fight. You know.
Messiah was not in their ideology.
You don't know what was. They were determined to live and to fight.
I have to say, you're in the most formal sense of the word, you may be correct, right? But it's very hard for me to find a Jew who doesn't believe that there is a better world that can be created, who doesn't believe that there is a world in which might can be secondary to right, who doesn't strive for it. It's a very, very common thing among us. Now, very often we try to do it, right, without a religious context, but we never stop trying.
Exactly.
Marx and Engels, Messianic Jews for sure, they had an image of a world that was almost perfect, right? Of course, it lacked something very important, which was God, right? And as a result, became terribly corrupt, right? You know, always you see it among Jews, is this Messianic drive. And by the way, I have to say, the majority of people in the world today, or certainly the majority of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, believe in a Messianic world. There's no question about that. We all believe there's a different process, and who it will be is a different question, right? But there's no question that there's an idea that a world can exist in which right is more powerful than might, in which peace can exist in the world. It's a dream that's existed for a long time, continues to. Right? There are cynics in the world who say, no, it's not possible. Man will always chew on man. But most people feel that this is possible for an enlightened world. Right? You know,
David, I will tell you, because we're talking about the subject. What we're talking about, you mentioned the Holocaust and stuff. People who were building the country, Holocaust survivors. I was in a kibbutz. Half of the people were with numbers on their hands. And this was not religious kibbutz. It was Shemarat Tza'ir. But you did not see more idealistic people in life, more devoted to build a good future for children and grandchildren, and devoted to everything Jewish and everything. I'm telling you, I was just in the
That
beginning.
only confirms they believed that by their own hands, by their hard labor, they can build this beautiful country.
Everybody has
you're as right.
No, I understand.
You're as right, but you have to ask
They never relied on any
it's
Messiah.
not the issue. The issue is each of them had their own image of the future, how it should be.
You're right, but I would argue with you about this that their view of doing this without God in the picture, without religion in the picture, was a product of a disastrous experience for a very long period of time. You know, you continue to get beaten because you're a Jew. In principle, you would think you would abandon it completely. None of them wanted to abandon it. They wanted to abandon the old Jew. They didn't want to stop being Jewish. They believed that there was a new Jew.
Absolutely.
The Jew who worked the land.
100%.
The Jew who was a farmer. Jew who was a soldier farmer, right? Jew who was a shomer, right? Who could guard the people, right? Still, it wasn't saying we're like everybody else, right? And if you think back,
This is exactly what nation was before.
If you think back about, the love that Americans have for Israel, and there is, I'm not talking about the administration, I'm talking about the nation itself, the people. You see it in Congress and in other places, right? Is based on the idea that it is an ideal society. Now, of course, it isn't. We're far from it, right? We know all the weaknesses,
Right.
But in 1948, 47, 48, the founding of the State of Israel was for many of the democracies, right? The people of the democracies, literally a shining light. You know, I did a film years ago with people who had come out of the Second World War, right, and literally shed one uniform for another. Right? They weren't all Jews. Many, many were not Jews. Right? But they believed that this was the next stage of something virtually divine. You know, a phoenix rising. You know, all the expressions, right? Has it succeeded? I would say to a much greater degree than anybody could have imagined it would. Right? Has it forsaken its faith? We struggle with this issue because, like everything among Jews, we're extremists. So you have extremes on one side, extremes on the other side. But go to Israel at Sukkot. Everybody is sitting at sukkah.
Absolutely.
They may not believe the this and the that, but you should sit in a sukkah. It's the right thing to do. Every restaurant has a sukkah. Right? Why? You know? The issue of hostility towards religion, right? If you're an extremist on either side, it's unfortunate, right? But the fact of the matter is that very soon the majority of people who are officers in the Israeli army are going to be people wearing kippahs, right? That the dream of a non-religious Israel has failed. And the dream of an extremely religious Israel will fail as well. Will fail as well.
Look at kibbutz movement.
Right?
Gone. No, of course it's gone.
No, there is a.
I will say about the kibbutz movement, you know, there was a generation of leaders of Israel who were born and bred from the kibbutz movement. It's finished. It's not anymore. There are people who live in a kibbutz, but kibbutz has lost its idealism, right? The idealism is among the religious. The idealism is among the religious Zionists. The leaders of Israel in the future will come from the religious Zionist movement, who have combined these two things, right? The dream lives with them. The dream of the founders of Israel, sadly, in their children, was not passed on successfully. You know, think about it for a second. Think about where they are and what they're doing, right? Those people who have a fire in the belly for this land, right, are the people who combine religion and Zionism. And we see it.
That's right.
We see it. And we know that the Officer Corps of Israel and the IDF, right, eventually provides the leadership for the nation. You know, they go through a process, but the generals of the IDF eventually become ministers in the government, right? When those generals came from the kibbutz movement, they had a certain political bent, right? When they come from the religious Zionist movement, they have a different political bent, right? So far, we don't see them coming from the Haredi movement, right? And we don't see them coming from the non-religious movement. The vast majority of the religious Zionists, that's the future, it seems to me.
But all the best elite units in the army and everything, it's all religious guys.
Religious Zionists. They're not Haredi.
No,
they're not Haredi. Right. So that's my point, is that, you know, to look in the blink of an eye and say, at this point, it is literally a snapshot in time. You know, in the history of a people who's 3,000 years old, 20 years, 10 years, 60 years, you know, it's like that. That's all it is. When the Jewish people adhere to the moral standards of Torah, we assume a different dimension of existence. We become worthy not only of the blessings of Torah and the conquest of the land of Israel, but also the coming of Mashiach and the ultimate national existence as faithful servants of the Creator. In order for us to be a light unto the nation, we have to be a nation. You know? In summary, Joshua's goal, Yehoshua's goal, and the substance of his plan. Now remember, we have to put this in juxtaposition to the plan that Moshe Rabbeinu had with his spies, right? Was to assess the spiritual state of Canaan and ascertain whether they were ready for the invasion of the Jewish idea. Rachav, and I would add in this case, Rachav, Pinchas, and Caleb, all right, was a test case. Her acceptance of the Torah confirmed the imminence of the conquest, that she recognized that a great force, an unstoppable force, was moving forward, even though she had been for 40 years part of this society of Jericho. And by the way, one shouldn't think that because somebody is a prostitute that they are frowned upon. She was a person who was respected greatly, by people. When the Jewish people are worthy, then the world will recognize us as God's agent and a moral force. It should come soon, b'mheira b'yameinu, and that is what He intended us to be. Then our conquest of the land will be complete, our settlement will be secure and uncontested, and God's plan for mankind will be realized. I think we should hold it here, just to let you know that next week we begin with crossing the Jordan. The spy mission is over, and we're heading into the battle itself. Right? So we'll continue next week.